little over a week ago, I was pottering about on YouTube, as I pretty much do every day at this point, and I came across a philosophy tube video. No, not that one yet, but one that I had seen a few months prior. So after having rewatched that, I decided to have a further peruse on the channel. And yes, upon one clackety click of the mouse, there in front of me was Abby's coming out video. So intrigued as I was, I gave it a watch. And after 37 minutes of some of the most beautiful storytelling and education that I have seen in a long time, I finished the video realising A, how freed Abby seemed and appeared, and that in itself was a very beautiful thing to witness. And that B, I knew nothing about transgender people apart from what the basic definition is to be transgender. Thus, I decided to do a bit of research about the history and the culture that surrounds transgender people in a bid to understand what it means to be trans and how societies have perceived it both past and present. Because, as Abby says, people like her have existed in all cultures across all recorded time. Now, I want to start off with a dictionary definition of what it means to be transgender, for those that do not know. So in the Oxford Dictionary it says, denoting or relating to a person whose sense of personal identity and gender does not correspond with their birth sex. Now, something that is quite key to understanding the context of this video is that sex and gender are two very separate things. Sex relates to the physical body that you were born into, the genitalia that you were born with, and gender refers to what you identify as. Now, I'm not here to give you a science lesson, so I'm going to link a video up here, that explains and help me understand the science behind why some people are transgender. But first, let me take you into the past. Now, it's evident that for over 10,000 years at least, but most likely much further back than that, there have been transgender people. Now, there have been cave paintings found from between the Neolithic to the Bronze Age depicting people of either a third gender or a transgender or a non-binary gender, in fact, with both bobs and peni. I can't see things because I'm a child. As well as figures with no gender-defining or sex-defining characteristics. And these have been found across Europe. The ones that I know of have been found in Italy and Greece and Cyprus. However, obviously we know that this must have existed across the whole of Europe, or the whole of colonised Europe at the time, as well as the rest of the world, obviously. Additionally, there's a burial in the Czech Republic dating from about 2900 to 2500 BC of a male individual who was buried in feminine clothing, who archaeologists believe was transgender or a member of this third gender, which is a reoccurring theme which I shall later get onto. Now, interestingly enough, when Europe entered the Copper Age, which was just before the Bronze, about 5,000 years ago, we see a change in the way that gender is perceived by people. Previously, gender didn't seem to be such a binary concept, but for some reason unknown to anyone, when the Stone Age ended and the Copper Age sprang into life and people started to be able to make metal weapons, armour, a lot of jewellery, metal jewellery obviously, and many things that we now associate with metal products, this divide between the two genders became a lot more prominent and a lot more similar to the way that we perceive gender in our modern day society. Now, in the Neolithic, it seemed to be that anyone who displayed any kind of characteristics, either physically or personality-wise, was seen as spiritually in tune. People thought that they were able to communicate with whatever higher power they believed in, whether that was a god or gods or spirits. And so, generally speaking, many, specifically male to female priestesses, were held in very high esteem, and transgender people appeared to be quite highly respected. Now, one of these reasons could have been the fact that, as Plutarch, a Roman historian, records, many cultures venerated an intersex deity called the Great Mother, who was seen to be a figure of whom possessed characteristics of two sexes that had not yet split from each other. And that may be one clue as to why male to female priestesses were seen as very important in society. Records of these priestesses have been seen from at least the late Paleolithic but most likely earlier than that being, 10, 12,000 years plus. And some think that it may have in fact been a requirement to be transgender or part of a non-binary or third gender in order to become a priestess. But I guess we'll never know. Now, as I said before, many non-Western and Western cultures pre-5,000 years ago had a very different view of gender roles. And therefore, archaeologists can no longer assume that gender means the same thing to a society in, for example, West Iran, in Hassanlu, which is a 3,000-year-old site where 151 bodies were found, and it appeared that 80% of those bodies were buried with artifacts that correlated gender-wise with the sex of the body. For example, there would be needles, garment needles, jewellery buried with the women, and then metal vessels, armour, weapons buried with the men. However, about 20% of these people were buried with a mixture of items, and there was one case where an individual of unknown sex was buried with male artifacts and was believed to have carried out male tasks while having been buried in feminine clothing. Additionally, the most famous find from this was the Hassanlu lovers, which turned out to be two males who were buried in an embrace. One was touching the other's face and the other had his arm around the back of the curled up one. And this prompted archaeologists, although they did not know the relationship between the two men, kinship wise, or whether they were strangers, friends, lovers, who knows, but it prompted the question as to whether sexuality was viewed in a very different way in those times. However, it definitely showed us that there was a third gender within this particular society. We don't know whether that meant that the individuals themselves, however, were the ones to identify as this third gender, or whether them possibly showing traits of the opposite gender meant that they were categorised by their own people as being part of this third gender. Now this brings me on to a cultural example of a third gender. Now, I don't know if you may have heard of this before, but there is a region in southern Mexico called, forgive the pronunciation, Oaxaca or Oaxaca, not quite sure, let me know. But essentially any man in this region who is a transvestite, transgender, is gay, either feminine gay or masculine gay, or essentially acts feminine in any way, is what they call a mouche. Now this mouche tradition has been around for many hundreds of years and is seen as an important role in society because the Zapotec people are very matriarchal. The men go out to find the crops or the fish to then bring back to their wives, who then go to market to sell on what they've harvested. Therefore, there's not always people at home to look after the kids or take care of the household or bring in an extra income or make art, which is where the mouche come in. It is in fact seen as a blessing for a mother to have a mouche son, and it is only men that can take part in this tradition. However, the men generally do see themselves as women in a way, and it's actually really highly respected to be a mouche. It's kind of one of the only places in Mexico where men can be transgender or gay and be well accepted in society. Now, not all mouche are transgender and they don't all dress the same or act the same. Mouche can identify and be however they want to be. There's even a section in the local churches where mouche kind of form their own brotherhoods, and in fact they will never ever have relationships with each other. Mouche do not see themselves necessarily as men and will not have sex with other gay men, because generally speaking, pretty much all the gay men in that region are mouche, and so it is only seen as a kind of relationship if a straight man has sex with a mouche. Interestingly enough, most mouche say that many straight men in the area have their first sexual encounters with a mouche. And this Zapotec language brings us on to another cultural phenomenon, which is language itself. Zapotec, which is what they speak, does not have any gender-specific pronouns. It is in fact the case that in languages such as Persian, Hungarian and Korean, they too don't have any gender-specific pronouns. Now, you may notice the tie between the site at Hassanlu and the Persians not having these pronouns. Now, especially in the Hungarian and the Persian, pretty much all the pronouns are gender inclusive. So they don't have actor or actress. They just have a general word for actors and actresses that is unisex. They don't say businessman or businesswoman, they just have business person. And in Hungarian, you'd have to specify, if you needed to, whether you were talking about a man or a woman. In Korean and Japanese and many East Asian languages, they don't have any gender specific pronouns at all, and you have to kind of pick up on the context of what somebody is talking about to know whether they are talking about a man or a woman. Now, the fact that these languages have evolved to be like this may point us some clues as to the sort of cultures and areas where non-binary views towards gender were taken. That's at least my thinking on it. Yet another place where they have many different words to describe gender, it's kind of going the opposite but still all very inclusive, is in America. Pretty much a vast majority of the Native American tribes had what they now refer to as two-spirited people. These were people of either originally male or female sex who then identified as more feminine or more masculine or non-binary or completely the opposite gender to how they were assigned at birth. And many of these people were seen as nannies or healers or shamans, as is the case for a lot of people around the world, and were again very highly respected in their societies. This is also the case for the Mahus of Hawaii, who before Hawaii got colonised by bloody Europeans, sort of seen similarly within their society as healers and caretakers and nannies, essentially. Now this brings me on to the Bugis people of South Sulawesi in Indonesia, who have 5 genders. They have Oroane, Makunrai, Kalabai, Kalalai and Bisu, which translates as woman, man, men living as women, or women living as men. Or Bisu are the ones who are most highly regarded in this society, and they are seen as non-binary or androgynous people who are also part spirit, and therefore are seen as shamans in their society, and are believed to be able to communicate with the underworld as well as the upworld, because they see the earth in kind of 3 tiers of life. And it's just another example of how people that identify differently are seen as, I guess they would have been seen in Europe over 5,000 years ago, as people who have these special abilities. I had to turn on the light there because it was getting a bit dark in the room. Right, let's continue, Mike. So in India, yet again, as you can see, there's quite a theme developing here. There are people who identify with their birth sex all over the world. And in India, there's another example. Within the Hindu culture, there is a term called hijra, which only applies to men, but it applies to men who feel as though they are more feminine than masculine. So essentially, this mostly relates to transgender men. And generally these men will wear female clothes, wear makeup, and will leave home at an adult age to go and join a clan of hijras who kind of live by their own codes of conduct and are quite well respected in Hindu culture. I think this is something that is not quite as common as it used to be, because obviously you've got both Hindus and Muslims, and generally speaking that sort of thing isn't well accepted in Muslim culture and religion, but it's still there, you know, still kicking about. Now, as I've said, you can see a theme occurring. Although this mainly happened with men who wanted to transition to women, there appears to be the commonality of a third gender, aside from obviously in Indonesia, that was there throughout much of the world, throughout many cultures. What we don't know, however, is how many of these people were non-binary, or how many of these people would have actually transitioned into the opposite gender if they had the technology to do that at the time. And I have to say, it's quite unfortunate, because before many places were colonised by the bloody Europeans, there appeared to be a general acceptance of all gender identities and sexualities in a lot of places around the world. However, it appears that the Judeo-Christian rules and regulations surrounding those two things got in the way of a lot of people's cultural beliefs, as we see with many other parts of people's culture, and so now the world has generally a less accepting attitude towards transgender people or gay people. You know, people that don't necessarily fit within societal norms. So I sort of wanted to finish with some conclusions that I've drawn from all this research. And I just wanted to say, it's interesting that the West tends to see itself as one of the most progressive parts of the world, especially like ideologically, politically, socially, but it fails to take into consideration all of the rest of the cultures around the world that have had many things that the West is currently struggling to legally and socially accept, such as people being transgender. And it's really just our recent history, our history of the last 1,500 years that is determining our current day collective views upon these sorts of things. I mean, even myself, I don't personally know anyone that's transgender, and I thought to myself, I watched Abby's video and I thought, how can you go from being the only sort of sex that you've ever been to transitioning into the opposite? I did not understand it, but then I realised that she was just playing a role, as she says. Mentally speaking, these people aren't necessarily ever the gender that they were born as. They are just trying to fit in, and that's what it seems to me anyway. I might be wrong, and I'm guessing it's different for everybody. And as I said at the beginning of the video, Abby seems incredibly freed by having finally been able to transition into the person that she wants to be. And I think before I even understood why people might want to transition, I saw that that was really quite a beautiful thing, to be able to feel like you can break away from the societal norm that we have in our country. And once you see somebody breaking away from the societal norm like that, you understand how integral gender it actually is to our lives, even when we don't necessarily think about it as cis people. But even as a cis person, you don't have to live the gender or heteronormative lives that we are kind of expected to live. You can break out of that and kind of create your own culture. We as humans are not hardwired to think in specific ways as we think we are. That's all down to the culture that we've been brought up in. And I think people should just be allowed to be themselves without having to identify themselves as a specific label or without a specific part of what people see as important within a person to rule their life, if you understand what I'm saying. So that was just kind of my take on things, and I hope you learned something. I'm glad that I researched history and culture that surrounds trans and non-binary people, because it has taught me something. I feel like I'm more accepting myself, to be honest, and I hope you've been somewhat educated as well. The more you know. But thanks for watching, thank you for listening, thanks for existing. You're doing great. Cheers.